Welcome to another episode of Rose Resource Room. Today, I am here with a special guest who's going to talk to us about all things Greek, church history, theology. But before we get into that, good morning and welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ro.
My pleasure. So, can you tell me a little bit about yourself? Tell me about you just as a person, and then we can get into some of the things that you do.
Okay, yeah. So, my name's Justin McGeary, and I guess a little bit about myself. I'll give real quick sort of backstory for your listeners. So, interestingly enough, I was sort of traditionally schooled from kindergarten through fifth grade. The Christian school where I had been going closed down. And so my parents were forced into this place where they had to think, well, what are we going to do educationally? And um, there were not many other Christian school options that were nearby, and our public school system didn't have a very good reputation as far as the kind of quality education that it was giving. And my mom, and there was an elite kind of prep school, but very expensive. Then my mom had been reading up on this thing that was called homeschooling. Uh, and so it was this moment where my parents were kind of like, oh, what do we do? And they sort of decided to leap in. They had actually experimented with homeschooling just a little bit with my brother who had been going through cancer treatment actually. And so he's well. But it was he was out of school a lot, so that was kind of my mom dabbled in it a little bit with the help of one of my aunts who was a certified uh, teacher, licensed teacher. So they were kind of working with that. So sorry, this is becoming a little bit of a long story, but anyway, in sixth grade we started homeschooling just really to test it out. And I ended up it was a struggle, a bit of a transition for me. I was a decently social kid, and trying to figure out, yeah, how do we find friends and find curriculum and these sorts of things. This is in the 90s. Um, and then I ended up really loving it. And it was huge in developing in me sort of a love of learning, developing my own Christian worldview. Um, Fast forward, I've done some campus ministry at the college level. I became a professor at a Christian liberal arts college for a number of years. That actually shut down, and I now teach at a classical Christian high school. I teach history to 10th and 11th graders. And I guess a little bit more about myself. I'm married. My wife and I, we have two adorable kids, 3.5-year-old, 1.5-year-old. And we have sort of started in that, as I was mentioning before we started recording, we've started a little bit of that homeschool journey already. We're teaching my son to read. Actually, yesterday, he um, he read his first story by himself, and he read a full sentence as which was really exciting. So we're starting to do some reading. We do a lot of kind of music appreciation kind of stuff. Um, so so yeah, so we plan on homeschooling. Um, so yeah, that's a little bit about. I guess I'll stop there. And if there's something you want to follow up, feel free.
No worries. Thank you so much for sharing. So, I actually want to touch on that reading piece a little bit because I know for some children, it doesn't just click and it's not something that they just do on their own. Some require a lot more instruction, and then there are different schools of thoughts in terms of do you start earlier or do you wait until it's later, where they're thinking of Russia or like, other countries. So, can you share a little bit more about what your process looks like with your 3-year-old?
Yeah. So so we definitely are sort of. I guess we kind of fall in the middle of where we are neither like get him started, get him as much, kind of let him be a kid, um, and sort of see where some of his interests are kind of going and trying to tap into what are the interests and then use those to kind of cultivate um, learning abilities and skills. Our 3 and a half year old he's definitely been interested in books. We do lots of just reading like together. So I guess that was and it just seemed like he really wanted to try to understand books. And so that's why we started into we're using the learning to read in 100 easy lessons. Um, and my wife actually did that. She did that before she went off to kindergarten. My wife also actually was traditionally, sort of more traditionally schooled and then homeschooled the rest of her, probably around middle school, high school as well. But her parents taught her to read at home. Um, so I guess really we were watching what are his interests. He loved books, and it seemed like he really wanted to figure things out. He was starting to sort of put those things together in church. Like, he would be like trying to follow along either with sermons or songs. He just was, yeah, really interested in words. My wife speaks Spanish and English, so he's also bilingual. Real interest in language. So yeah, we were just kind of sort of following him, trying to give some guidance, and we're just like, I think he can read, so or he's ready for it. So that's how we came to that. It wasn't like a kind of clear. We had this philosophy of children to start reading as early as possible or something.
All right, kudos to you, mom and dad. So you talked about lifelong learning, and I think for the average parent, they may say, I want a child to be well-rounded, and they want the academics, they want the music, the language, the sports, all the things. So I guess my first question would be, as you're thinking about all these things, a well-mannered child, someone who is thriving, right? Like you want them to want this, right? You don't just want to force them, like we were just talking about. How do you curate that lifelong learning environment?
Yeah. Yeah. This I think is an important question because I think that's, at least in my experience with so many homeschool parents, is the real kind of drive behind it is the whole reason they homeschool is I want them to love learning. Um, and that was definitely the case with my parents. So I guess I could talk a little bit from what they did that kind of um, sparked that in me. I would definitely describe myself as when I was sort of in the more traditional setting, I was very motivated by grades. So I did well in school. I think it was also not just the grades, but getting the affirmation from people that, oh yeah, nice work, you got the A or whatever. Um, but I wouldn't necessarily say just have described myself as someone who loved learning, say for learning's sake, or because you know um, the world God has made is wonderful or something like that. Um, I think for me, there's a few things that really cultivated the love of learning, and I guess the big thing was I would say is the way my parents approached education. My mom is sort of uh, she truly loved learning. She was the person that would kind of we'd go through museums. It actually became a joke when we would go on these like homeschool field trips. My mom would read every single thing in the museum. Uh, that actually might not have been the most helpful thing in and of itself. But my mom just she loved to learn. She was curious and she loved the homeschooling along with us. She was excited about learning with us, refreshing things that she had learned in the past, things she didn't know about. So I would say that that was huge. And we did a lot of reading out loud as a family. And so love of literature, stories were things that um, I definitely got from my mom. And I think that my dad, one of the things he saw that as a strength of my mom, and he really started to kind of, so my mom sort of modeled it. And my dad, so he was a little suspicious actually of the homeschooling initially. Like he was like, are our kids going to turn out sort of socially weird or something, those kind of typical concerns that people have. But I think what he saw the strength that my mom had for learning and directing us. And he also um, sort of caught the vision of what can we do for our kids here. And he was the one that sort of said, I don't want you to worry about grades. I want you to think about what are you learning. And he actually, interestingly enough, he carried that along when I went off to college. he was the one that like when I was like having some sort of like crisis, like I've got to write this paper in like 2 days or something like that. I don't know how I'm going to get this done. He would say, okay, let's refocus here. What are you learning? Like, he was the one that kind of kept that vision for learning continuing after. So the first thing is my parents. I think the second thing was that I caught, uh, particularly in high school, a pastor who met with me really cultivated in me this kind of understanding of a biblical worldview, which is something my parents were doing as well. But he really helped me to kind of think about creation, the goodness of the creation, all the things that God has made. And, isn't it kind of amazing um, that the complexity of the world, the intricacies, the amazing things. So I found that it was also then having it grounded in this larger biblical vision of what life was in God's world. And actually, it was actually at a CHAP convention that I heard a speaker say, I must have been in like 10th grade. He said something, it was maybe a little bit harsh, but it was like really good, which was, he said, shame on you if you aren't absolutely fascinated by everything that God has made. And that was actually for me like a sort of aha moment. So we actually were homeschooling in Pennsylvania. So we went to CHAP conventions. And this maybe leads me to the third thing, which was my parents, I think, did a good job of putting me in touch with um, resources, other people that also loved learning, were thinking about why they were learning. So we would go to CHAP conventions together. And I, as a high school kid, went and listened to people talk about education and philosophies of education. A church, co-op. They would just put us around a lot of people that were excited about learning and had specialties. We took physics with a Pittsburgh physics, Pittsburgh University physics professor, homeschooling family. So those kind of things, I think were really helpful for me in developing lifelong learning. So I'll pause there. That's just in my own experience. I guess I could talk from the perspective of a teacher as well, but I'll stop there.
No, I'd love to hear that as well. But I love how you talked about the modeling. A lot of times we want to see things in our children that we aren't showing them. And I've
Yeah.
heard people say it's not what's taught. A lot of times it's what's caught,
Yes.
right? So we may say, you should love to read. You should read your books. Books are important. And then we're on
Yeah.
our phone all the time. Like they've
Yeah.
never
Yeah.
seen us pick up a book. So
Yep.
I love what you talked about in terms of curating that environment in the home, modeling it, and then having the kids understand that if something is really a priority, then you will do it. So let's hear your
Yeah.
thoughts from a teacher's perspective.
Yeah, so I think that the teacher's perspective would be somewhat similar and maybe unpack a little bit of the experience. One is, yeah, you've got to see it. So I think as a teacher, I've got to be excited about what I'm teaching for my students. I've got to demonstrate curiosity and then sort of give them the tools is another thing, I think. That was one thing, I guess, that happened is along the way. Um, for my parents as well as a teacher, you're trying to figure out, well, okay, I expect you to learn these things, but I've got to help you get there. And I think so. I think that obviously when kids are younger, they need more help. They need a little more of the hand holding. And then slowly they call it scaffolding. You slowly take more things away and allowing more independence. And I think that's actually something I'm seeing a lot with my students is they get excited when they are given more responsibility over their learning. Um, so giving tools, giving responsibility, I think is huge. Um, and and then I think the other key thing is t grounding it in sort of the deeper questions. I think oddly enough, um, students really crave um, they really crave deeper a deeper reasoning for why they're doing stuff. And so I think that's a little bit of worldview or a lot of worldview, a little educational philosophy. Those kind of things can be really helpful for helping students think through, well, why do we do this? For me, that was huge. And I see that in my students as well that they love digging in a little bit to the philosophy and thinking through the big questions. Um, I think that sometimes it's we're maybe afraid of scaring kids off with, you know, I don't know,
Depth.
their eyes glazing over talking about philosophy. But I think you can do it in a way, theology, worldview, in a way that can be engaging, especially if we as educators, as parents, are ourselves gripped, at least to some extent, by these things, um, and can say, here, like as a teacher, I like to be able to point to here's a moment in our, here's like a book or a historical event or I just am going through the French Revolution with my high school kids and connecting ideas about from coming out of the Enlightenment and how those are influencing and driving a lot of the French Revolution. The students gave presentations recently where they were trying to connect the historical events of the French Revolution with the uh, philosophical ideas that we had just read about. They really got into that, at least it seemed to me. And so, yeah, I think that connecting daily life to the bigger picture is another real helpful way to cultivate that love of learning.
I'm really happy that you mentioned the piece about scaffolding because I think a lot of parents, with all the pressures that are on them as homeschoolers, it's the thought of how do I make sure that my children are independent and they can actually function without me, where they can make decisions and they're not constantly saying, Mom, is this correct? Mom, am I doing it right? Dad, am I doing
Yeah,
it correctly? But I think the part we forget sometimes is if we give them the tools, right? Like we don't just send a
yeah,
farmer outside with no tools. So
yeah,
if we do that scaffolding, as you mentioned, and then we slowly pull back, then that's probably that sweet spot because
yeah,
some parents will kind of like throw the kids out there like sink or swim, go figure it
yeah,
out. And then others are probably coddling too much, right? So it's like,
yeah, yeah,
where is that sweet spot of saying, okay, I'm going to show you this, then we'll do it together, then you'll show it to me, and then
yeah,
I'll let you go.
yeah,
And then I
yeah,
love the piece that you talked about with the real world connection.
yeah,
I've had so many times where I need to get a concept across, let's say something about apples or George Washington or whatever. And you can pull up 25 books and show them, look, this is what it says, this is what it says. But how much stronger of a real world connection when you take the kid to the farm or to the grocery store and you say, look,
yeah,
apple, stem, core, cut it in half,
yep,
dissect it.
yep,
George Washington, let's go over to, Washington's Crossing, or let's show you something that's actually a real world connection. Why would we care about George Washington? Why would we care about cursive? Why do we care
yeah,
about Latin and these things
yeah,
that are dead when you
yeah,
pull it all together and you say, well, this is how it benefits you in the
yeah,
modern world. And we're
yeah,
not learning history just so you can say in 1492
yep,
or
yeah,
in 1776. Like, that's not why we're learning history,
yeah,
but how does it connect to your everyday life and what are we
yeah,
learning from it?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think when the learning is no longer purely abstract and it's
Right.
like, oh wow, yeah, I definitely would say like in history, you see students come alive when they're like, oh my, uh, the things that we just covered, I can clearly see how that impacts the way we live, the way we think, sometimes even who I am, and I learn about what my ancestors have gone through uh, that shapes me, yeah, those things are just so helpful. And here's one other thing that I thought of
Mhm.
that I think is really helpful. And this is something that I got particularly out of. So on the side, we can talk about this later, maybe, uh, these tutorials. I started doing tutorials where students write essays. One of the things that I found is that when students' work is not just turned in, but then is engaged,
Mm.
is discussed. Students, I think, love to have their work appreciated, especially from their teachers. So I've done a lot of teaching, and I know that I think that students, the idea that they turn something in and then never, it only gets graded
Oh,
rather than discussed or engaged, uh, I think is another huge thing. It's sort of like, okay, this is valuable. What you did was valuable, not merely an exercise. And then it's often in those not just assessment, but engagement with their work, where you can do some of this sort of scaffolding and giving them the tools and say, what went well? What was hard? So you can actually use sort of the end product of an assignment, so to speak,
right.
that allows the student to debrief with you. Where are they strong? Where are they weak? How can we oh, we need to get you that tool, or you did really well in this. This is tell me more about this idea or this thing that you're learning about. And I found that that is also huge for students as far as their love of learning is to see, oh, it matters and it matters to you, right? It's not just did I get an A or a B or a C or whatever, that sort of thing.
Sure. So let's actually stay on that a little bit. So I know there's the concept of the Oxford tutorial, and you kind of just explain like why it's important and how the engagement actually promotes that deeper engagement versus just checklist, throw it in the garbage, you're done
Yeah,
with
yeah.
it. So what is it? Is it the same thing as classical education, and how does it differ from the way most people teach? And then lastly, I'm guessing this is something like C.S. Lewis and like these greater, I don't want to say greater, but like these people that we look
Yeah,
up to, right? That's probably the way they study. So tell us all
yeah,
about like what it
yeah,
is, how it differs, and other ways to practically implement it.
yeah, yeah. So when I was in college, I spent a term abroad at Oxford, and so I got this exposure to this unique system of learning. And yeah, so what is it? What it is essentially at Oxford, unlike say an American college and even some British universities, the core of the education is so you. One of the things you do is you go to Oxford and you hear these brilliant people. They have lectures, but the lectures are independent from the tutorial in one sense. Like you don't have the same, like if you go to an American college, usually whoever's lecturing is also going to guide some discussion or something like that in a class. But at Oxford, where the core learning happens is in the tutorial, which is a meeting of a tutor, usually a specialist in a particular area, and you have students that meet with that tutor weekly. And the tutor every week comes with a set of questions, a set of essay questions. If you're in sort of a like literature, history kind of area, if you're in mathematics, you get like sort of a set of math problems. But you get a set of essay questions. The student can look over those and decides, here's the one I want to tackle. And then they spend a week um, researching, reading, because the other thing the tutor gives is sort of a curated list of suggested resources. So, and then the student is given these essentially two things, plus you've got the lecture series that are happening at the university and the libraries. And it's like, here you go write an essay. And so it's the epitome of independent learning, which I think in that sense it fits really well with home education. And I found that particularly high school homeschool kids, this is great because they've already been learning how to be an independent learner. So it really, but they get guidance, right? They're not totally off on their own. So they come back, they turn in an essay to their tutor, and they read the essay out loud, or sometimes they'll read it before they read the essay usually out loud. I like to have my particularly homeschool high school kids read it out loud because that is another feedback loop as they read their own writing. They hear it and they're kind of like, and I can remember doing it at Oxford myself, being like, oh my, what a terrible sentence. I can't believe I put that on paper and I'm reading in front of this person. Or simultaneously like, oh wow, it was gratifying when I saw progress right in my writing. And those are the things that I see. So what I do with Trinity House Tutorials is we take this kind of some of these Oxford components, and I have students writing regularly. And one of the things is we don't grade every essay, but the students every week get to sort of enjoy as well as sort of struggle through the things that they liked and didn't like about the writing. And we talk about the writing process. We talk about what they're learning. So what happens is, and this is where I think some of the magic of the tutorial comes in, is it's the student's work that becomes sort of part of the centerpiece of their own education. And then as the tutor, I can say, you know what, this is really good. Here are the things that you just hit the nail on the head. And then here are the things, right? So give some guidance, some direction. Here are things you can improve in the writing. And by the way, here's some of the kind of things that are going on in this time period. If we're doing history or in literature, what about these themes? And because they've spent some intensive work, they haven't necessarily thought of every single essay question, but we'll go through the other questions and just see what do you think about this? And then I always come with here are like 5 to 10 things that are you want to know about, say, this novel or whatever we're looking at. Um, but that's kind of the nutshell of the tutorial. But it's this regular writing, regular feedback. And one of the things I think students love is, first off, they're not graded on every essay. So it puts an emphasis on learning and growth rather than final product. Can you write a really nice, perfect essay? And so one of the things I love about the tutorial is that they start to see writing not simply as can I perform, can I create a final product, but they realize that writing is this powerful learning tool. And so I'm always trying to shift my students away from just writing as end product to writing as a learning process, a learning superpower. So we regularly will talk about their writing, and their writing isn't graded every week. And I think that gives a little bit of freedom to not write a perfect essay every week, and use it to think. But it also then we spend so much time on the writing, that I think they start to it cultivates some joy in it. Like I see that I'm learning, I see that I'm growing, because the frequent feedback, the regular rhythm of writing, is really helpful. Um, so it's and to how does this relate to classical education? There's incredible amounts of overlap with classical education. Um, you know, emphasis on primary sources, digging into kind of deep, historic questions that people have been asking for a long time. Um, the emphasis on dialogue and conversation. So it's not just the writing piece, but the in tutorial conversation. And one of the things actually that I see students developing through the tutorial, um, because you can't hide, that's one of the things, like you can't be in a class of 12 or 13 or 20 where you can be like, well, you know what? I don't know exactly what's going on here at this moment, so I'm just going to hide, right? You can't do that. So students learn a lot of poise, the ability to carry on an argument. So again, that's another point with kind of classical education, this idea of argumentation and rhetoric. Students learn poise and the ability to use language, not just in writing, but also in conversation. Um, and yeah, this is, I mean, you mentioned C.S. Lewis. This is how Lewis was educated. He was actually sort of home educated in the sense that his dad got him a tutor in uh, high school. He went to boarding school as well. Um, but yeah, this is the system that Lewis grew up in, and it is a system that produces quite a number of significant thought leaders, and major figures because it's rigorous, um, but I think that it's also highly interpersonal. Very relational form of learning. So I think that in some sense, it's kind of like when I was thinking about it, I was like, I'm kind of amazed. I mean, in one sense, a lot of homeschool parents are already doing this. Like, it's not really. Um, so it's just that, as a teacher, as a tutor, I come in and work with some high school kids. So it offloads some of that work from parents. But really, these kids, this is what they're doing in home education in many ways. It's just that we're sort of maybe systematizing it a little bit and adding some more rigor to some of the components like the regular essay writing. And I have heard some homeschool moms be like, it's great because it's hard for me to get my kids to write for me, because they don't finish it or, you add that external motivator to some extent. So, yeah, feel free to ask any follow-ups. That's like, I was a little rambly there.
No, 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 it's fine. So I want to make sure I understand in theory what's happening. So you want the children to wrestle with truth. You want them to think more outside of just the basic, like what color was the shirt or what was the food,
Yeah.
right? Like you want them to infer, you want them to critically engage and think, right? So
Yeah.
I don't think I'm putting you on the spot because this seems to be your jam. So
Yeah.
let's do like a minute or a 2 minute role play. So
Yeah.
obviously you're
Yeah.
the tutor and I'm going
Yeah.
to be
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
child. We can take anything, Chronicles of Narnia, history, you
Yeah.
choose. But like help me understand like some of the questions because I'm clear on
Yeah.
the process, but what are like some of those big ideas or
Yeah.
questions you would ask? Like, okay, so what's
Yeah.
our
That's
topic? What are we talking about?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So the idea is that all of the questions that I come up with for my students are, so at Oxford, and actually one of the things I'll back up real quick and then we'll do the
Sure.
role play.
Okay.
Um, is you actually teach how to analyze a question because, and this is one of the things I found distinctive at Oxford versus like even at an American college was I think that in the American system, it's kind of like, here's your question, and we're really kind of pretty forgiving. At Oxford, they were not so much. If you didn't understand the question and didn't answer the question, they're kind of like,
What happened here?
what happened here? So analysis of the question, yeah, this is great. So a lot of the questions are, yeah, they're big picture questions about key features of, let's take the Chronicles of Narnia. Um, there might be a question along the lines of how does Lewis bridge um, our world with another world? Might be, and so the student would have to think through how does Lewis do that in telling a story that feels not too fantastic, right? It feels believable, right? And by the end, you believe that there are these parallel worlds, right? And time isn't the exact same. So a question might be something like, yeah, how does Lewis uh, tell the story in such a way that it is, or to what extent does Lewis tell the story in such a way that it is believable?
Mhm.
Um, so that might be a question. Or here's a question, might be a theological question if we were to approach it theologically, would be like, how does Lewis explain, or how does the death of Aslan parallel with um, uh, biblical portrayals of Christ's death, right? So I
That was
don't know,
very, yeah.
you want to tack, I've got you, there's two options. Uh, or we could tackle, let's see, Edmund, right? What is it that causes Edmund to betray his siblings, right? And so then you have to unpack what's going on inside. So there's some
Really just a
questions.
Turkish delight, or is there more to that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Why is it food? Yeah, I don't know. And so the student would take one of those and they'd write an essay. Um, and then we would talk about it. So I don't know, Ro, what do you pick a question?
All right, so let's talk about Aslan and the allegory of Christ's death.
Yeah, yeah. So um, m- y- you throw out a few things, I'll throw out a few things. So right, there's that he has to die. He has to die if Edmund is going to be okay, right? Is one of the things. So we have this clear idea of substitution. So we could talk about, maybe the student might talk about ideas of um, biblical passages of substitution, right? Say Isaiah 53. The student might they might write an essay where they're like, well, here we have Isaiah 53 seems this clear like we were like this, right?
Mhm.
Um, all we like sheep have gone astray, turning to our own way. But the Lord has laid the iniquity of us on this guy, whoever this guy is in Isaiah 53, right? We find out later that it's Jesus. But this idea of substitution is very kind of clear in the place of is language. I would expect my students in if they're unpacking Narnia, where is their language of in place of, right?
Mhm.
Um, and Aslan has this moment where the girls are kind of like, the scene right after he's resurrected. The girls
That
are like,
big
"Whoa,
beard
what's
ejaculating. Yeah.
happening?" And he unpacks. He explains it. So I would expect my students to, if they're going to write a real nice essay, that would be a key passage, right? And if they didn't, I would say, "Hey, you wrote a decent essay, but what about this section,
Yeah.
right?" Aslan actually explains that if he dies in the stead of, I can't remember the language now, if he dies in the stead of somebody willingly, if a victim willingly gives
Yeah.
himself for someone else, there's a deeper magic, right?
Mhm.
Um, so, so yeah, so substitution would be something that they could write about.
Awesome.
I'm
And
trying
then
to,
even the animal chosen, right? So we think of the Lion of Judah, or we think
yeah, oh
of
yeah,
like,
that'd be great. Yeah, the Lion of Judah that conquers. Yeah, exactly.
okay.
That would be another great component.
No,
And
that's really good. We're pulling out the themes, and I love how you talked about the substitution because sometimes I talk to my kids and I said, this was a shadow. Like when this happened to Joseph, do you
oh
remember
yeah,
anything similar happening to Jesus?
yeah,
When this happened to Jonah, how long was he in the belly of the fish? 3 days.
yeah,
Does
yeah,
that sound familiar with something
yeah,
else? Like, yeah, I really like that how you bring that all together.
yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, I had a student actually write a paper on that and did an excellent job. And actually, in Christian history, there are models of different ideas of sort of what the atonement involves. And I had the student in the question kind of think about some of these different models and see if they could figure out which model do you think Lewis is using. Um, and so that was, I thought that was the student did a really good job on that. I kind of, yeah, distinctly remember that essay was a good one.
All right. So we talked about lifelong learning and how to curate that environment. And then we added a layer by talking about the biblical worldview, how
Yeah.
to make sure that kids don't just think, there's history over here and there's science over here and there's geography, but no, God is in the center and He's the creator of all these things. And how do
Yeah.
all these things work to not only fulfill
Yeah.
His purpose, but also for our benefit? And
Yeah.
then we
Yeah.
talked about the how. So you dig in and you wrestle with the truth and you ask these questions to promote the curiosity and the critical thinking. Let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the what.
Okay.
So I know some of the things you are really passionate about would be like theology, early church history, and Greek. Let's start with Greek.
Okay.
I agree because I've had the conversation. Latin is a dead language. Why are we teaching Latin? And I'm like,
Yeah.
because 60% of English is Latin. And if you are going to be a doctor or a lawyer or
Yeah.
scientist, you probably want to know those Latin words. So
Yeah.
let's kind of dissect Greek. Why should a
Yeah.
child learn Greek?
Yeah. So I taught Greek for many years at a Christian liberal arts college. So, and I've definitely been through the ringer and done quite a bit of Greek at seminary and then some graduate studies. I would say you can make a lot of similar arguments that you would make with Latin, which
Okay.
is at the Renaissance and Reformation periods, Greek becomes very influential, um, particularly for the English language. So we have lots of um, English words that have their roots back in Greek, just like we do in Latin, particularly in fields like medicine. But there's other things. Actually, our word apologetics, take a theology term, comes directly out of the Greek for defense. Uh, and I think that in one sense, you could study almost any other language and get a lot of benefit from it because by looking at a different language, you look at a different grammatical structures and how words are put together, and it makes you more aware of how your own language works. Now, I think that one of the things, particularly in sort of the classical movement with regards to Latin and Greek, that's very valuable is aside from these two languages being incredibly influential, is that you get to sort of pair ideas about logic and rhetoric with these languages and see how some of these early writers are thinking about rhetoric and how you put words together in persuasive combinations. Um, and so I think that there's this kind of, on the one hand, sort of this grammatical component, but there's also sort of the rhetorical value for understanding how to speak and use language persuasively. And I do think that um, helping our students um, develop an ease with the language that they use, even if it's just the English, comes, I think, through at least having this point of comparison between two languages. Um, I think on the other hand, another feature of just studying languages is it does introduce sort of critical thinking. It has similarities to sort of mathematical reasoning, right? You have this very ordered system of communication, and you're trying to learn how the pieces fit together. And so it teaches sort of analysis, right? You got to take it apart. It's foreign to you. You don't have the same ease with English, so you don't get tripped up by, well, this is just how it works. You're like, I got to take the pieces apart and then put them back together to show the meaning. So you get the analysis component and then a synthesis. Um, and and so I think that that's really valuable in an education. And so yeah, I'm a big fan of encouraging the languages. My wife's bilingual, Spanish and English, and it's amazing to watch our son as he's thinking about one language versus the other, even at the age of 3. He definitely has tools that I did not have until I was even in college. So it definitely is massively, I think, enhancing for a student's critical thinking abilities and understanding of language, which is like our fundamental tool as humans that God has given us is language. Um,
Yeah.
so
Help me
yeah,
unpack the rhetoric piece a little bit.
yeah. So one of the things that's interesting with language is we have our pretty typical ways of talking, but then we always have this kind of register of thinking through exactly what we're saying in order to achieve a certain goal. And so rhetoric is this taking into account the situational moment, my audience, and my subject, and putting those things together in a as powerful and influential way, persuade, if I'm persuading them, uh, I want them to take a particular action. How would I do that? And it's really interesting to look then at the history of not just Greek or Latin, but English.
Mhm.
Some of the great um, speakers. So we just in my 11th grade class, we just finished going through the Civil War. And so you have two very powerful speakers, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And so this is where kind of, if you've studied sort of Greek or Latin, both Frederick Douglass and Lincoln they're reading scripture, they're reading Greek and Latin writers, and they are borrowing, stealing strategies. And so we read a Douglas speech where it's actually one of his later speeches during after the Reconstruction period. And he goes through the South and he comes back and gives a speech in Washington, D.C. as a celebration of the Emancipation Proclamation. And he's like, we have a long way to go. And so one of the things he does rhetorically is he uses repetition. So he gets this right. And he has this phrase in this one paragraph where he just goes, tell me not, right? And what's interesting is he's changed the words around. That's not really exactly how most people would talk, right? I mean, we know exactly what he's saying, but tell me not. Instead of, he doesn't say, don't tell
Don't
me,
tell me.
don't tell me, don't tell me. He says, tell me not. And the refrain has power, but then also the changing up of the words has a power, catches your attention, because he's trying to get his audience a little bit off guard
Yeah.
so that they'll think about what he's saying and it'll register and he repeats it, repeats it, repeats it. So yeah, I think that there's this value in studying language to be like, yeah, to understand great speakers, but then understand how communication works, I think is kind of key.
Awesome. And then it makes me think of Shakespeare. Like he's
Oh,
very
sure.
right. Repetition
Oh,
is his go-to.
absolutely. Yes.
Awesome. All right. And then quickly, can we touch on church history?
Oh,
Why is
yeah.
it important to study church history?
Yeah, well, I think one of the big things is that most of the issues that we address in our own day don't come out of anywhere. They have a history,
Right.
but I think that also those who've gone before us have often wrestled with the tough questions.
Nothing new
So
under the sun, right?
yeah, and so a lot of the issues that we see cropping up today are going to be issues that people have um, addressed, explored in the past. So, I think it's helpful to go back and see how were they reading scripture? How were they thinking about why is it important that Jesus is God again? Um, uh, Reformation, right? What is faith and what is its significance? Um, why do we stand on scripture? I think that just if only for understanding what we believe, church history is valuable, aside from the fact that there are just some incredible stories. I think reading about Christians who've suffered before can be really strengthening. I know that it was for me to read about Christians who either died for what they believed or suffered for what they believed. And you're like, wow, okay, I'm not alone in this. So yeah, I think church history is really valuable for studying history in general, but for gaining some encouragement, for seeing how issues are unpacked and understood and why they're important. Those are at least a few things I think make church history really valuable.
Thank you so much. I know we did not do enough justice indulgence to church history, but I think you really underscore the importance of why it's important to study. You are such a wealth of information. Any final thoughts? Anything else you want to share?
Um, you know what? Not really. I guess I'll make a quick plug that if parents are interested in the tutorials, I'd love to chat. I think it's something like, so I do it with Trinity House tutorials, but it's also something that parents can do with their kids. So it's a very it's something they can replicate. So I'd love to chat with folks. And I guess one of the other thing I would say maybe is a word of encouragement to conclude, like, so it's been over 20 years since I graduated from high school, and I can remember hard days. Um, not every day feels like we just had an amazing educational day. How powerful, look at all the things that we learned, right? I think that it's important for parents to remember that, right, the educational growth, the Christian growth happens sort of like it's little drips, it's a buildup, right? You're building towards something. And I think that maybe, um, I guess I would just encourage parents to remember that. Um, and with our kids, like sometimes you're like, oh man, today was a rough day, but the Lord sustains us and it doesn't all happen in one day, right? Um, we're creatures that God has made that grow over time. Um, and maybe having some of those things that help you recapture, refresh your vision, finding moments throughout the year where you look at the big picture. Where have we come from? Where are we going? Can be really helpful as well. Um, and I think maybe going along with remember it's the slow drips, pray a lot.
Yeah. No, I
Um,
appreciate that. I think a constant theme in everything that we talked about, whether it was the biblical worldview or the church history or Greek, it's not about the end product. It's really about the process, right? Like we hear
yeah,
these cliches like, life is not a sprint, it's
yeah,
not about the destination, it's about the journey. And that's what I'm really hearing. So
yeah,
just to kind of piggyback on what you're saying, for like any parent who's just sitting there looking at grades and measuring growth on these assessments or these tools that public schools use because they have 20, 30 kids and they
yeah,
can't,
yeah,
do that one-on-one. I'd really encourage you just to spend some time with your kid and actually see what's
yeah,
happening. Like,
yeah, yeah,
you can't always measure learning just by a
yeah,
multiple choice quiz. So I really
absolutely,
appreciate you sharing that.
absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today, Justin. And
Oh,
I
thank you for
look,
having me.
of course, my pleasure. Thank you so much.